Welcome back to our deep dive. We take these stacks of sources, and really try to pull out the core insights for you, our listeners. Today, our focus is pretty specific. It's on one descendant from a family line we've looked at before, DuBose Heyward. And crucially, on a piece of art he created back in the 20th century. Something that, well, it really shook up American culture and kind of redefined his family's whole legacy. We're looking at this fascinating story, deep, old, aristocratic roots meeting head-on with this powerful, modern artistic drive.
Yeah, that collision, that's really the key to Heyward, I think. He was already a known poet, a playwright, a novelist, and he was right there smack in the middle of this cultural whirlwind people call the Charleston Renaissance. So our mission really is to trace that aristocratic background we've been talking about and then zoom in on his most famous work, which is the short novel Porgy. Came out in 1925, and that book, of course, well, it became the absolute bedrock for the opera Porgy and Bess, which everyone knows.
Okay, right. So let's unpack this a bit. This isn't just some dusty old history. This work connects the DuBose family name. I mean, a name with roots going way back, colonial times, the Revolution. It connects that name to this huge, globally recognized, and yeah, often really fiercely debated American masterpiece. So our goal here is to kind of synthesize all that. The aristocratic side, this vibrant cultural movement he was part of, maybe even helped create. Also the specific real-life stuff that inspired Porgy, the actual people and places. And then, yeah, spend some real time looking at the legacy of the opera. Because it's complex, right? Controversial, sure, but you just can't deny its impact. It's like watching history and art just weave together and make something new. A new kind of legacy. Okay, so before we dive right into Porgy itself, we really need to get a feel for the world Heyward was living and writing in. The cultural climate, the economic situation. He didn't just write this in, like a bubble, right? So what exactly was this Charleston Renaissance? It sounds like this sudden, intense burst of creativity.
Oh, it was intense, definitely. And you could argue it was, well, necessary for Charleston at that time. It basically spans the 1920s and 30s, and it really came straight out of, decades of economic struggle, political decline, too. All that aftermath from the Civil War, Reconstruction. Charleston was the city just dripping with history, but it felt like it was being left behind, especially with all the industrial boom happening up north. So among the sort of intellectual class, there was this real sense of loss, a feeling that their own unique history, their culture, it was literally just fading away.
Huh. So the Renaissance wasn't just about, painting pretty pictures or writing poems. It sounds like it was almost a civic duty thing, a preservation effort mixed with art.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It was a very conscious attempt at, well, cultural revival. The main goal for these artists, writers, preservationists, it was to actively go out and capture, document, really celebrate the culture of the South Carolina Lowcountry, because they saw it as unique, but also, as you said, fading. They thought this distinct blend of, the landscape, the history, the different communities, especially the Gula culture, which had managed to stay pretty distinct, they felt it was all under threat, like it was going to get swallowed up by this modern kind of standardized American culture. So they felt this deep need, this duty almost, to assert that regional identity.
Okay, that context is just so important. It really explains that impulse, that need to document things, which seems to drive Porgy. And our sources are clear. Heyward wasn't just, riding the wave. He wasn't passive. He was actually helping create this new cultural landscape, a leader even.
Oh, absolutely. A central figure, a catalyst, really. DuBose Heyward and others like him, they saw the power in working together. And a really specific, crucial example of how involved he was right from the start. He co-founded the Poetry Society of South Carolina. And this wasn't, just a casual book club. It was more like the institutional engine driving the whole Renaissance.
Okay, but how does something like a poetry society actually drive a whole revival, practically speaking?
Well, it did two really essential things. It gave them a platform and it gave them a focus. First, it just brought the whole intellectual and artistic community together. It gave poets, writers, a place to share work, get feedback, encouragement, a structure. But maybe more importantly, it subtly shifted where they were looking for inspiration. The artistic gaze turned inward, It suddenly became okay, even fashionable, critically accepted, to use the Low Country itself as your muse. The landscapes, the dialects, the people. So it encouraged writers like Heyward to maybe turn away from, European trends and look right at the streets, the marshes, the life just outside their own fancy doors.
Yeah, that shift is huge. Because to write a novel like Porgy, which is so specific, so detailed about the culture, you almost have to be part of a community that's actively saying, yes, our unique identity matters. Let's look at it. So this Renaissance, it kind of provided the philosophical backing, the artistic permission, maybe,
Hmm.
for someone like Heyward, coming from this old Southern aristocratic background, to turn his attention seriously, empathetically,
Yeah.
to the lives of people living right there in his city, but who are usually invisible.
And right there, that's where the inherent tension starts to bubble up, isn't it? Because the movement itself, it had these nostalgic, kind of aristocratic roots. Often it was people trying to reaffirm a Southern identity tied to the past, maybe a romanticized past. But the art that came out of it, especially Hayward's work, it often reached across those class lines. It brought stories from, the docks, the tenements, places that high society probably just ignored, right into the literary spotlight.
That crossing of lines, aristocracy looking at the marginalized, that really feels like the core drama of Hayward's life and his work. So let's just ground this for a second with the actual family tree. Our sources are really clear. Hayward is directly linked to that historic DuBose line we've talked about. So for you, the listener who's maybe been following this family saga across the generations, how exactly does this DuBose Hayward connect back to those Revolutionary War figures we've traced?
Oh, his background is pure textbook Charleston elite. DuBose Heyward wasn't some outsider who just showed up. He was absolutely a product of that established, deeply rooted aristocratic society we've discussed in earlier deep dives. And that name, that background, it gave him a certain automatic status in Charleston, even if personally he apparently faced some financial struggles later on.
Right. And we've mentioned before how in these old Southern families, sometimes the mother's line is just as important, maybe even more so, for establishing that pedigree, that standing. So where does his specific tie to the DuBose name come in?
Yeah, in his case, it's through his mother. Her name was Jane Scriven DuBose. That's the crucial link right there. And Jane Scriven DuBose's father, so Hayward's grandfather, was Edwin DuBose. So the name carries through, and it's instantly recognizable within that Charleston social world.
Okay. And tracing that back even further to the revolutionary roots we keep mentioning.
Right, so you go back one more generation from Edwin DuBose, and you find his father was Samuel DuBose Jr. And here's where that connection to, foundational American history snaps into place. Samuel DuBose Jr. was the son of Captain Samuel DuBose Sr., and we've identified him before as a pretty significant Revolutionary War hero, one of the figures who really established the family's prominence in South Carolina.
Got it. So it's a clear line, a documented chain right back to the people who are setting up the economic structures of the whole Low Country region.
Exactly. And you can trace that line all the way back to the original settler, Isaac DuBose. And the significance here is just, it's profound, really. Heyward, the artist, he inherited more than just the family name. He inherited this deep historical tie, this emotional connection to the very land, the very society he was writing about. He was completely embedded in the culture, the history, the sort of geographic reality of Charleston, the very reality whose culture he was documenting through his art.
That background, it just gives his work this specific built-in tension, doesn't it? Like you said, he wasn't some outsider moving to Charleston to write about poverty as a subject. He was an aristocrat looking maybe literally across the street or maybe just over a garden wall
Yeah.
at a community he grew up alongside, but was totally separated from by centuries of, Southern social rules, hierarchy.
It creates this really fascinating internal dynamic. His background gives him a certain kind of authority, right? He knows the city inside and out. But at the same time, that same background is what fuels the complexity and definitely the later criticism of how he portrayed things. Here he is, a descendant of the Revolutionary founders, people who essentially created the Southern social structure that depended on racial hierarchy. And yet he's the one who writes the defining work that brings the African American experience of the Low Country to, global attention. That paradox, that contradiction, it sits right at the heart of Porgy.
It's kind of the ultimate twist on his heritage, isn't it? Using a voice that comes from privilege to try and amplify the voices of the unprivileged.
Okay, so let's move now from that historical backdrop to the actual creation of the novel. What was he actually building on? Where did Heyward get the idea for these really specific characters? The unique way they talk, the vivid setting of the novel Porgy. Well, the novel seems to have come out of just deep, sustained observation. Driven by that whole Charleston Renaissance impulse we talked about, trying to document that Low Country culture before it vanished, Heyward was inspired by what he saw himself, his direct observations of the Gula community right there in Charleston. The Gula culture, descended from West and Central Africans brought over as slaves to the coastal areas. It had managed to hold on to its distinct language, its customs, its spiritual traditions really remarkably well. And Heyward seemed to see this culture as one of the great, unique treasures of the South, but also, like we noted, something fragile, vulnerable to modern life.
So he was really interested in capturing the the sound and the rhythm of their lives, not just a plot. Did he base the actual setting on a real place?
Oh, absolutely. The physical setting was based on a real Charleston tenement area. It was known as Cabbage Row. Historically, this was, a pretty crowded, contained community space where Gula residents lived, under segregated conditions, obviously. Heyward took this real place and fictionalized it in the novel, giving it that name everyone knows now, Catfish Row. And fictionalizing it like that, it let him sort of condense the community, maybe intensify the emotions, and really make the setting itself feel like a major character in the story.
Okay, and the title character, Porgy himself.
Mm-hmm.
This disabled man, but so determined. Was he just purely made up? Or did Heyward draw from life for that central figure, too?
Our sources are pretty clear that Porgy was directly based on a real person living in Charleston at the time. And knowing it's based on a real person, it adds this layer of almost documentary power to the fiction, right? It reinforces that idea that this story was rooted in observed reality. The man's name was Samuel Smalls, but apparently he was commonly known in the community as Goat Sammy because he was disabled and he used a goat pulling a small cart to get around.
Wow. Goat Sammy. Such a powerful humanizing detail. Was Heyward actually close to him? Or was it more just seeing him around Charleston?
It seems like the inspiration was mostly observational. Heyward apparently recalled seeing Goat Sammy sometime around 1924. He was watching a street scene play out in Cabbage Row. And the image of this man, physically challenged, navigating life in that really vibrant, maybe chaotic community, it just struck Heyward immediately. Like, that's a dramatic core I need. The story suggests the inspiration was very sudden, very visual. It triggered this deep sense of the character's struggle, but also his resilience.
Okay, so the novel comes out in 1925. It does well commercially. But the really key point for us, the big impact, is how it shifted things in American literature.
Yeah.
How exactly was it seen as groundbreaking, especially in the context of the 1920s South?
Well, compared to what else was out there at the time, it was, revolutionary is probably the right word. When it came out, it was genuinely one of the first major Southern novels to even try to portray Black life and culture with a serious, and this is the key word, empathetic eye. You really have to remember what American literature was like then. It was dominated by these pervasive minstrel stereotypes, overtly racist caricatures. Or maybe that romanticized, sort of patronizing plantation fiction where Black characters were just simple props in the background. Or maybe comic relief.
Right, so Porgy basically shifted the focus from just caricature to trying to show complex humanity, giving these characters an inner life that was pretty much unprecedented in mainstream American fiction at that point.
Exactly. Heyward really tried to show a whole community, fully realized, dealing with love, faith, violence, just trying to get by economically. He focused on their spirituals, their language, their resilience. Now, we absolutely have to look at this with historical perspective. Critics, even back then, noted, and the work still gets criticized for a potentially romanticized perspective.
Right.
Heyward was still filtering this experience through his own white upper-class background, but you just can't ignore the immediate impact it had. The sympathetic, three-dimensional portrayal, it was seen as groundbreaking. And it was immediately controversial because it shattered those older, accepted literary tropes. It forced a conversation about shared humanity in a place where very few white American writers were even daring to look.
Okay, so the novel was a success, a literary breakthrough, but that leap from a well-regarded, maybe regionally focused book to becoming Porgy and Bess, one of the most famous operas in the world, that feels like a huge jump.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a massive leap, and it was driven almost entirely by the vision of one man, one of America's absolute greatest composers. The key player here is George Gershwin. Simple as that. Gershwin read Porgy, and apparently he felt this immediate, just overwhelming connection to the material. He instantly saw that the Gula culture Heyward described, the rhythms in their speech, the spirituals you could hear in the streets, the sheer emotional intensity, he saw that as the perfect source material for a truly American kind of opera.
So what was Gershwin really trying to do when he thought about an opera based on Porgy? He wasn't aiming for just another Broadway musical, was he?
Oh, no, absolutely not. His vision was much bigger. He famously said he wanted to create an American folk opera. He was apparently kind of tired of American music, always looking over its shoulder towards Europe, seeing validation. His big goal was to take the grand form of classical European opera with its complex orchestrations, its formal structures, and fuse it organically with uniquely American musical roots. Jazz, blues, spirituals, those gullah rhythms Heyward captured. Porgy and Bess was meant to be the work that would define American classical music on its own terms, a statement piece.
Wow. That's a huge ambition. So once he had this idea, how did the collaboration actually get started?
Well, Gershwin reached out directly to DuBose Heyward and also to his wife, Dorothy. Although it's important to mention there was a step in between. Before the opera really got going, the Haywards had already adapted the novel into a play, a straight play, no music. And that play was actually a big success on Broadway, premiered in 1927. So that run definitely proved the story had dramatic power, commercial appeal, which probably encouraged Gershwin even more that it could work as this grander opera production.
Ah, okay. So Hayward wasn't just like the passive author whose book got optioned. He was actively involved in shaping it for the stage already, which suggests Gershwin really valued his firsthand knowledge of the community, the source material.
Oh, his involvement was absolutely crucial, essential, and it's what really cemented his place in the history of this masterpiece. Hayward took on two really critical, defining roles in creating the opera. First, he wrote the opera's libretto. That's basically the script for the singers. So that meant shaping the whole dramatic flow, making sure the dialogue sounded authentic, capturing that Gullah dialect, translating the feel of the novel into stage action.
Okay, the libretto. And what was the second role? You said it defined his legacy.
The second role, and this is huge, was writing the lyrics for many, maybe most, of the opera's absolutely iconic songs. This is the part that really etched the DuBose family name into, like, global music history forever. The collaboration between Hayward and Gershwin, it sounds like it was pretty intense. They actually took a trip together down to the Low Country Islands to really immerse themselves, study the Gullah culture firsthand, make sure the music and the words felt rooted in that reality.
And the most famous example, the one everyone knows.
Yeah, I mean, when anyone hears that world-famous lullaby, Summertime, right, which has got to be one of the most covered, most instantly recognizable songs ever written, what they're hearing, the words they're hearing, that's the poetry of DuBose Heyward. The lyrics seem so simple, but they're incredibly evocative. They just perfectly capture that humid, slow, languid feeling of a low country summer.
That collaboration is just, it's really something.
Yeah.
You've got the descendant of the Southern aristocracy writing the lyrics for arguably the most famous song about the marginalized Gullah community, set to music by this brilliant Jewish-American composer from New York. It's this incredible mix, isn't it? High culture, folk culture, literature, music, spanning the whole American social spectrum, really. And the work that came out of it just seems to transcend all those origins. So, Porgy and Bess premieres in 1935. It is, without a doubt, a cornerstone of American musical theater. The music itself is just staggering. But, and this is a big book we've kind of touched on, we absolutely have to acknowledge its complicated, often really controversial history. You basically can't talk about the work without getting into the debates. It still sparks about representation, about authorship.
Yeah, that tension is completely inseparable from the work itself. And maybe that's just the nature of great art that tackles social identity, right? It sparks debate. It probably should. The controversy, it really boils down to those issues of authorship and representation. Basically, the question of who gets to tell whose story.
Yeah.
And how.
Okay, so what's the specific core of that historical criticism, especially coming from, say, the African-American intellectual community over the years?
Well, the main point of contention, historically speaking, is the fact that it was created by a white author, DuBose Heyward, descendant of that old Southern aristocracy, working with a white composer, George Gershwin, and it was initially performed for, let's be honest, a largely white high culture audience. So critics argued that the characters, even though they were treated sympathetically compared to what came before, were still being viewed from an outsider's perspective, maybe relying on certain familiar tropes or, like the phrase goes, kind of romanticizing poverty.
And we know some major black cultural figures criticized it pretty harshly right from the start.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest there was some strong disagreement.
Oh, absolutely. The pushback was sharp and it was immediate. You had figures like the great Duke Ellington, the jazz legend. He famously dismissed it as minstrel stuff, arguing that the portrayal of Black life was just too simplistic, that it didn't capture the complexity, the modernity of the African-American experience at the time. And the writer Langston Hughes, another giant, he also voiced reservations. He criticized how the characters were shown as mostly impoverished, sometimes criminal, suggesting maybe they lacked dignity, aspiration, that it kind of perpetuated negative stereotypes, even if unintentionally.
So the critique wasn't really about the quality of Gershwin's music necessarily, but more about the portrayal of the community itself. Sounds like the tension was really deeply felt right when the work first came out.
Precisely. And the whole history of casting and productions was complicated too. I mean, yes, the opera has famously employed and been a vehicle for hundreds, maybe thousands, of incredibly talented Black singers Over the decades, it gave them major roles, but it also meant those performers had to navigate the complexities of performing a work written by outsiders, a work that sometimes maybe felt like it bordered on caricature. They were essentially performing folk culture for largely white, high culture audiences. That's a tricky position to be in.
Right. And yet, despite all those really essential, necessary criticisms,
Hmm.
the work has not just survived, it's thrived. It's been embraced, championed, performed by generations of black singers, musicians, opera companies, often pointed to as this crucial showcase for extraordinary talent, providing roles that just didn't exist elsewhere in the opera world. So how do we hold both sides of that? How do we reconcile the critique with the endurance?
Well, maybe the reconciliation lies in just acknowledging the undeniable impact the work had and continues to have. The piece that Heyward and Gershwin created, whatever its origins, it gave this powerful international voice to a community that had been largely marginalized, invisible on that kind of stage. It used a universal art form, opera. It took the gula culture, the details of life on Catfish Row, and put it right onto the world stage. It forced critics, audiences all over the world to engage with the lives, the struggles, the artistic richness of this community in a way that just hadn't happened before in that high art context. And the music itself, it's just such a powerful cultural force. Maybe it transcends the identity politics of who wrote it.
And that brings us right back around to the family lineage, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The ultimate connection here is that creating this work, controversial, yes, but undeniably powerful and universal, it completely recentered the DuBose family's legacy.
It absolutely does. This whole creative process, it forever linked the DuBose family name, a name that before this mostly stood for, colonial settlement, plantation, southern aristocracy. It linked that name instead to this globally recognized masterpiece of American culture. It performed this incredible cultural pivot. It shows how one individual, through art, can take a historical lineage and completely reorient what it means for future generations. A singular, transformative creative act.
That really is the power of art, isn't it? To reshape how we even understand history. DuBose Heyward, inheritor of this powerful, maybe restrictive Southern legacy, he chose to use his artistic voice to document the lives of the most marginalized people in his society. And in doing that, he achieved this fame, this kind of permanence that arguably goes far beyond his Revolutionary War ancestors. So we've traced this family line across, 2 centuries, from revolutions, colonial beginnings, all the way to an artistic renaissance in the 20th century, culminating in this defining, yes, controversial, but absolutely enduring piece of American art that's traveled the entire globe. The whole journey just shows so clearly how historical context shapes art, right? And then how that art turns around and influences history, influences legacy for generations afterwards.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a really interesting question, I think, something for you, the listener, to maybe carry away and think about. In all these ongoing debates about cultural appropriation, when does something like an empathetic portrayal, even if it is written by an outsider like DuBose Heyward, when does it cross over? When does it evolve and become an enduring piece of sort of universal artistic heritage? Something that's ultimately claimed and loved and performed so powerfully by the very community it depicts. It's a fascinating space, isn't it? Where maybe authorship gives way to a kind of ownership through performance, through lived experience with the art.
Hmm. That's a question definitely worth mulling over long after the music stops. As always, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Now, our sources suggest we're making a complete shift next time. Different geography, different focus altogether. We're moving away entirely from the Charleston Low Country, away from the world of high art and cultural debates, to tell the story of another really remarkable descendant from this line, Hampton Coit DuBose, and his 50 years spent as a missionary over in China.
Oh, that'll be a fascinating journey. Talk about a change of scenery. From the American South to the other side of the globe, driven by a completely different set of beliefs, a different kind of ambition. Yeah, we look forward to unpacking that remarkable story with you next time.